Dear friends, it's the first day of our meeting, and it's quite normal that, at least in our universities, that if a starting time is 9, then everything starts 9:15. So this is maybe in other place also, and it's now we can say it's exceptional weather and maybe late events yesterday and so on, so this is a reason we decided to have this 15 minutes. But now it's just a good time to start. We have one lecture, one talk by Mario Paolucci, and the topic is very interesting. It's about reputation. Absolutely vitally important thing in functioning of academies and academic institutions. And then, as you have seen, we have a group work in 4 groups, and the announcement I would like to make is that during the group work, it's 10:15 until 11, there is a coffee break. So you will hear this bell ringing, and I know that it's very hard to get out from interesting group work place, but try to focus on this coffee during 10 minutes. I will announce this once more before we leave this room. But now it's my pleasure to invite Mario for this lecture, and it depends on the length of the lecture. We will probably have some discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and good morning. Sorry, I want trick to just to try to wake myself up. The first speech of the day is, well, not as bad as the last one, but it's difficult. So, this is reputation, and reputation lessons for cognitive modeling. It's my oldest topic of research, my first essentially serious topic of research when I started in the Institute of Cognitive Sciences. So it's fond old memories. I haven't done new work on this in the recent years. But preparing this class, which was given in Brazil a few months ago, I found out that there is much still to be done. And some good student could be a blessing in this case. So, let's sum it up. I have a bit too many slides, so forgive me, I will have to skip some. I know it's annoying seeing them flickering, but I'll have to adapt with the times. I will start with a general introduction of our research and our approach. Then I will present the cognitive theory of reputation that I have developed together with my supervisor, Rosaria Conte. And then we will touch issues like open research questions. I will slow down a bit on that part. And then there is a part on technology of reputation, which was something agent-based that we developed together with Jordi Sabater from Barcelona. I'm not sure that this is really of interest for you, so let's see if we have time. And so let's start with the institute. We are a research institute. We don't teach. Of cognitive sciences. We used to be called just a psychology institute, but since it happened that most of our researchers went into directions of artificial intelligence, then this change was decided to get the name of Institute of Cognitive Science and Technology. It's the National Research Council in Italy, so it's in Italy is like France. So the National Research Council is an institute that does research. It's a big institution with 100 institutes, actually. It's not like the other countries where these kind of institutes are funding agencies. It's a place where we really do research. The Institute has about 100 researchers going from studying sign language to robotics to, as in our case, simulation. We were founded by Rosaria Conte, who rose to be vice president of the Scientific Council, and I was her student, and now, together with another of her students, we co-direct the laboratory of agent-based modeling and simulation. Well, I can't mark in here. Okay, this is the group. The research that we do varies on what we call cultural artifacts. A cultural artifact is something that is important in culture, and important enough to have one of those big labels like norms, authority, institution. We try to analyze from a theoretical and philosophical point of view this kind of artifacts, and then to provide implementations of them aimed to simulation. In the recent years, we follow the trend that several other simulation laboratories have started, which is to mix simulation and experiments. So now we also have a quite big experimental line. So our social simulation was to be, but still is our main interest, and we use agent-based tools to model reality. There are many ways to introduce agent-based modeling. I already touched them yesterday, so I will be quick on this, try to be quick. But one interesting approach is to distinguish them from what we call the equation-based models. An equation-based model is a model in which there is a variable of interest, which is normally an aggregate variable, and then you study the evolution of this variable by a set of equations. This has the advantage of producing, in some cases at least, what we call closed-form solutions. And if you have a solution, then you can know a lot about your system. But it has the disadvantage of essentially suppressing individuality and diversity inside the system, because you can't manage as many variables as there are individuals. So we use a different approach in which we consider that the object of the modeling is some kind of individual. It can be a representative individual of sort, but normally we try to make this individual extremely detailed and as plausible as possible. This can be done at different levels. So yesterday you've seen Schelling's model about segregation, and this could be a theoretical abstraction in the list that you see, from case-based to typification to theoretical abstraction. The other model, the model of criminality, which was aimed to model a specific reality in a specific place, it was a case-based model. So here I write that LABS works between typification and theoretical abstraction. In fact, we've already moved ahead from that point. The approach of the individual-based approach is as old as philosophy. Now, this is St. Thomas that says that nothing exists if not the individuals. This goes as back as Platonic ideas. I mean, you have to decide when you study something if your reference for reality is at the level of the individual, and then the generalization is an abstraction, or if abstraction have substance, and then the individuals are kind of ghosts of those abstractions. But let's go back to simpler things. One other key concept in agent-based social simulation is generation. So we call an agent-based simulation a generative explanation. Why do I call it a generative? Because since I write everything in my code and I see something happen, then I generate a phenomenon starting from principles that I have to make as explicit as possible, code which is by its nature, total explicit, even if somehow opaque. So if you want to understand everything that's happening, you have the code, but the code may be more difficult to read. Anyway, if you generate a phenomenon completely in silico, you have a complete explanation for that. So you know what you put in, you know all the algorithmic choices you've done, and then you know the result. This is called a generative explanation, and I'm sure that every step of this explanation is reachable by the researcher. It happens that when you do theoretically based work without an implementation, you are skipping some key points. And that you see when you try, for example, to replicate even simulations. If you start from a paper for me is an extremely unyieldy and ill-suited way to communicate research at the current point. It's something that we have inherited from the past, and it's, for example, for simulation, it has really big problems to convey the key information. So if you try to understand what's happening from a paper, you know that you see immediately that when humans try to tell the story, they skip several points. When you try to go from the description to the code, and then you run the full generation process, you see that there are gaps. If you run a simulation and you prepare the full package, which is from starting to theory to implementation to results, then you have a full generative explanation. So this is summed up with a phrase from Epstein, and from Epstein, if you didn't grow it up, you're not explaining it. Our other characteristic in the area of agent-based modeling is our interest on minds. And that's also an important position that we defend, which is different from other groups and also inside our institute. So we start from the assumption that minds exist and can be modeled. What we do is an old-style cognitive approach in which a mind is a manipulator of symbols. We don't do, or I mean, we've tried, but we don't always do logic-based approach, but we have explicit representation for our objects. So for us, a mind is an important part of the model. You immediately see the contrast between our approach and the neural networks approach. If you are a researcher in artificial intelligence or are interested in neural network, you assume essentially that the mind is a byproduct of neural activity. So your interesting level of existence is the network, and then the mind is something that emerges from the network. We don't want to go there because the path from that to having a representation, explicit representation of key concepts, that's our approach. And let me say it again, like something like norms, something like reputation. If you're starting from the neural level, then you will not get to the mind level. The mind level will be very difficult to explain. You will have some kind of black box approach, difficult to say. So we explicitly model minds, modeling not only the relation social processes, but also the internal cognitive processes, or at least that's what we try to do. Okay, this was about generative explanations, but we went through that. From the technical point of view, this approach has developed specific platforms. So if you go on the web, you can try to look for what these names correspond to. And these are packages that you can use. Most of them are free to use, and most of them are now also open source. You can use them to develop your agent-based simulation. Of course, this is code, so you could start from scratch. But starting from scratch is detrimental for the cooperation inside the community that does this. So it's very difficult to maintain the code and to exchange it. If people agree on a common language, then it makes things much easier. This is debatable because it has advantages and disadvantages. Most people, including us, now is using the simplest of those tools, which is the NetLogo tool. It doesn't scale much. So if you're interested in the technical point of view, you should look at something more complicated like Mason, which is scalable. And if you want to see what's the state of the art in cognitive description of the minds, that's what I was alluding to before, you could go to JSON and see that it's really complicated to develop something with an explicit cognitive approach. There are several weak points in this approach. If you are used to see systems, to try to solve systems to get closed form solutions or approximation that have general invariance properties, then you will find this approach very awkward, because what you get is essentially a machine that produces a very large set of data, and you're never sure you explored correctly the space of parameters. Much worse is the space of algorithmic variability that is hidden inside the model. The algorithm itself is explicit, but you never know what happens if you could make small changes in the algorithms. As much as possible, every algorithmic choice should be justified by some theory, because in this case, you start to understand what's in the model. Algorithms are complicated and full of details, so sometimes the researcher makes choices which are not obviously justifiable, and in this case, also some algorithmic variability should be explored. I had this idea of crowded simulation at that point. It never started up. But it's comparable to the issue of replication in the science in general. This kind of approach also should be replicated independently as much as possible. I think I've touched those points. Initializing simulations. And yeah, it's curious that I just written this before getting into my current problem. The second point says, initializing simulation socially but also internally. So what's the cognitive status? That's exactly one of the weak points in the criminality model that we are developing. That model has an opinion dynamics exchange system as one of the key ingredients. And to say it shortly, what happens is that people talk about issues like, important issues like relative deprivation. You have relative deprivation if you think that your social group is disadvantaged unjustly against other groups. And having a relative deprivation is a key ingredient for example, criminal or terrorist acts. So you can think you are in this situation even if it's not true, and if you can talk about this to people. We're modeling this exchange of ideas, and then we arrive to the point in which we have to say, okay, how do we initialize this situation? To initialize this, we should know at some point in time what is the distribution of ideas on this subject in the general population. Now, it's already difficult to get a clear idea of what is the family structure, and we have census for this. This other kind of information is very difficult to extract. There are sources, if you're interested in this kind of work, you will know that there are sources like the Value Survey, which is a big survey on European values and other psychological points of view, but it's difficult to translate this in a good simulation initialization. Okay, let me move forward. Let's go straight to reputation. Why reputation? Well, that's what I said in the beginning. We want to find some specific cognitive object and then build a plausible model of it. This object will be the key for some simulations and some experiments later. But first of all, we want to have a clear definition of what happens in the people's mind when they think about reputation. So if you look around from between papers and dictionaries, reputation is a word that's used to define essentially what is said about others. This information is used in several ways. So reputation is defined as social knowledge. Reputation is about others, and others means that if you are interested in others, then it's a social phenomenon. A social knowledge that allows for the accomplishment of various social decisions. Reputation has helped regulate society, but it has become even more crucial in this modern age of connectivity, characterized by a dramatically enlarging range of interactions and the continual generation of new types of aggregation. This is a complicated way to say that reputation is very important with eBay and Facebook now. And you meet and interact with people that can be without limits of distance, maybe with some limit of language. And systems that you use, for example, to decide which bakery to go, or if a tire place that changes your tires is cheating on you. So you try to see if someone has heard something about some doctor to decide if you want to go there. Then this system has been expanded to describe a much larger network of connections that comes with new possibilities, new technological possibilities. So reputation is an evolutionary cultural artifact developed by mankind to enforce social order, based on traditional social remedies such as word of mouth and chatty talk. So the traditional channel for reputation was gossip. It has probably evolved along with implicit norms to encourage social desirable conduct, such as benevolence of altruism, and discourage socially unacceptable ones like cheating. So if you have a reputation as a cheater, then that spreads very fast. And this is one of the first things that we noticed, that reputation spread independently of its of the value of its content, of the truth value of its content. So reputation can be used to point out to people that perform unacceptable behavior and to avoid interacting with them, but it can also be used as a calumny to exclude someone from a social situation. Well, for what concerns reputation in the web, I think you're all aware of what happened. It was, at the beginning especially, one of the key mechanisms. For eBay, the reputation system was maybe the most important asset. In this case, it was a kind of simplified reputation, but it worked exceptionally well, at least from that point of view. Now the technological situation has changed, so we tend to rely less on stars and points and more on the real parts of the social networks. This could be an interesting point for some new research, but I don't have something on that. Reputation is a precursor to online traces that kind of touch the issues. So if you have a reputation, an online reputation, you have a set of scores, memorize something. Now, what you have memorized in several systems is much more than just the scores. All your behavior is tracked and archived. This moved from a system in which, for a practical reason, we reduced the reputation to a score, because you have to see the score of someone, to a more complicated system, maybe more akin to the original one. Because right now, if you want the reputation of an eBay vendor, then yes, you can get the score as the first proxy. But what if the transaction is important? Would you stop there? What I will do is first thing is to place a Google research on that vendor. This means that even I don't have access to private repositories, but I do some profiling. I mean, we also have this despicable attitude that when we start to interact with some other researchers, we go to his Google Scholar page. We spy on his Facebook page. So reputation now is back to being composed by several independent parts. And of course, the dark side of this is that profiling is and will be used to manipulate you, and in some cases even against you. This also would be a fantastic research trace for a thesis or something like that. Yeah, that's back to online reputation. But so I think I have convinced you that the subject is deserving of some study. Let's go for a moment back to the roots, because I said, okay, reputation can be useful for social order, for social control. We have simple examples that we can imagine from our everyday experience, but where it started and what can we learn from social variations in the implementation of reputation. In this case, it's always useful to look into anthropological evidence. Studying the history of concepts and ideas is a difficult task because in many cases you only find one path. And you never know if this path was a very strong attractor, in the sense that even if there was some change, everything would happen more or less the same. I guess that simpler things like, for example, having eBay, that was bound to happen. Even if Omidyar didn't make it, someone else would have made it, and that person would have discovered that idea of giving scores of 1 to 5 to people was a very important asset. It's so simple that before or later someone would have found it. But other things could have followed different paths. If you want to look into this kind of different paths, then you can't do experiments because even if, as I said before, we probably live in a simulation, we don't have access to the levers, so we can't manipulate the simulation. We have to live through it. Even if it's difficult to consider other possibilities. Anthropologists often help into opening your approach to these things because the only kind of experiments on this subject that we can do are what are called natural experiments. Everybody knows what a natural experiment is? No? Okay, when you have an experiment, then it means that you have to try to change something and then have a control and an effect group. That's a basic, everybody knows that. If you run an experiment without a control group, then you're out of science proper, and even that, a control group in many cases is not enough. But if you want to have kind of proof that something has an effect, then you need to have this control. Now, if this is a drug, then it's easy. I get a group of people, another group of people that must be as similar as possible, and here difficulties start to arise. And then one group gets the medicine and the other group gets the placebo. Normally, placebos are extremely effective, so it's difficult to fight against the placebo. If you want to do this in society, what do? You take two cities, and in one city you implement universal basic income, and in the other you don't. What if all the people from the control city migrate to the universal basic income one? Because they can get it there, but not at their own place. So it's extremely difficult to do social experiments, and that's a key idea in policy studies. The only thing that you can hope is that nature and case happen to do the experiment for you. So what are people looking for? People are looking for places that are as similar as the reality can allow, in which by chance it happened that two very different decisions were made. And this is a natural experiment. Of course, they are extremely imperfect, but if you find something that looks comparable and doesn't communicate too much, because otherwise the effect is entangled, then you can say the result of our measure is that because when they didn't do it, it went in another way. You can imagine how difficult it is to really find two cases in which the situations are similar. But that's what political scientists and researchers of this field do all the time. They try to do comparisons. So anthropological evidence helps because we are lucky of that, well, essentially because there is not as much, because we have more water than land on this planet. If we have more water than land, then we get islands. Islands are kind of useful for this kind of thing because they isolate civilizations. So up to some point, and up to, 100 years ago, because then we essentially connected everything, people had the chance to develop civilizations in a kind of independent way. I mean, some people say that Japan, for some cases, it could be studied like a natural experiment because by historical chances, it was strongly self-insulated at least up to a certain point. As much as you could do on this planet with a large population. Smaller population, like in the Polynesian Islands, can get this kind of isolations much easier. So we went to look at what is known about reputation in small isolated societies. And I will give you just a very quick summary because otherwise we'll never get to the policy part. But this is a joint creation of Talanoa in Bagaton, and it is in Fiji. Essentially, this is a word meaning idle talk. And this is interesting because this idle talk is not idle at all. It is an essential part of the hierarchy formation. So what are people using here? People are using stories that are told as if their truth value was uncertain, but they are using those very stories to specify who has a role of what in the society. So essentially, since this speech is done together, there's no attribution to a single person, and this will remind you of something. Of what? No attribution to a single person. This was the trick that we used those 2 days in the group work. You don't attribute the statements to anyone in the working group. It's an old trick that helps. You don't need to point out who is saying something. It helps construct the social discourse in a different way than it will happen if you had to label your statement. So you will not say some kind of things. Maybe it will stop something. Maybe it will free something. It will stop something because, I mean, if you're the kind of people that think has a Nobel Prize idea, you will not say that in the group because then it will not be your idea anymore. But it will help also people speak freely. So it's, if you speak freely, then after the group work, you're more inclined to speak again with those people, and you have a better idea of who you're talking with. So this kind of narrative in Talanoa is called bole. The verb means I've heard saying, or someone is saying, or they say. In this case, you tell the story without attributing the source. This causes the speaker to keep a distance from what he or she says. It's not reporting his or her own opinion, but he's reporting voice or rumors. The language is complicated, as you can imagine. Understanding this kind of discourse requires training and knowledge of the setting. Or even targets are never clearly identified, and they use a lot of abstract concepts like metaphors, irony, and implicit communication. This happens also in other cases, and now we move to the Hopi in Arizona. And in this case, you can see one of the key effects, which is gossip is used when political authority is monopolized. So in this case, you really have you see the advantage. When someone starts to occupy a space that is larger than the others in authority and in the discourse, the people with less power essentially use the power of calumny to stop them. The key ingredients here are the ingredients that we also find in a good calumny. The source is not revealed, the evidence is not brought about, not disconfirmed. So it's, if I say that, well, Tom's left, so I can't use Tom. Well, let's use Tom. If I say that Tom stole my breakfast, well, it's strange because you will go to Tom next time you see him and say, but that guy, when you weren't there, say that you stole his breakfast. It's very different if I say that, you know, guys, someone told me that he's seen Tom taking the breakfast of another person. Then it's more detached. It's less likely to cause some of you saying, going back to Tom to check the truth of it, but it will leave a trace. And then if you're having breakfast with Tom, you will keep your breakfast close to yourself. So to sum up, what we find in those kind of societies is that gossip and reputation have strong hierarchical or better anti-hierarchical effects. It's using the anonymization or relative anonymization of sources and the innate fun that is connected to spreading this kind of information to maintain what I've written here, maintain a social hierarchy, but essentially to maintain a flat social hierarchy against the emergence of leaders. Now, when we finished collecting up this evidence, this question really came up. Do we have these characteristics also in design systems? Design systems are back to eBay, back to the thing that we have created to manage reputation on the internet. How much of the natural potential of reputation was really used? Did the simplifications, the unavoidable simplification of online system cause, deplete the power of reputation, or did they use them all? Okay, so general conclusion, but I think I've said that. And again. So, to understand, to get the answer to this question, is there, do we have everything that could be used on reputation system in the system that we design, or something could be added? We developed a theory of what, in our opinion, are the main ingredients of reputation. On the theory, we could start building simulation, because now, when the theory is complete, we have all the ingredients that we think important. And now I will quickly go through some of those items, because then I want to get quickly to the final research questions, which are the approach. I think I went. This is the book where we presented the theory. And essentially what we propose is the definition of a set of roles and the study of the superposition of those roles as evidence for directions in reputation, together with another ingredient that we will see later. So these are what we call the operationalized social cognitive factors. Let me go back to at least read those 4 names. So, the anthropological evidence was about using reputation to maintain some social hierarchy, or in other words, to uphold a norm of fairness and equality, essentially. Many kinds of reputations are about defending some rule, some norm, The other main kind of reputation can be seen as a skill reputation. So you can have a reputation as a cheater, and that means that you're violating a norm of honesty, or you can have a reputation as a good mechanician, and then it's a skilled reputation, but it also has a normative part, which is you're respecting the norm that says that if you're doing some job, you must be skilled at it. So it's a competence norm, if you want. If you use this approach, then you can start to distinguish roles in reputation, starting from the evaluator. The evaluator is someone that observes the phenomenon that will cause reputation. So if you go to a doctor and you have an experience, you have your tires changed and you have an experience, then you are an evaluator. The target of the reputation is what the name says. So in this case would be the doctor or the mechanicians or the tire changer. And the gossiper also is what the name says, is the person that spread the news. You will immediately say that the gossiper and the evaluator in most cases are thought to be the same. So if you go to eBay, for example, at least in the current version, to spread some evaluation, you must have had the interaction. So in that case, evaluator and gossiper are the same. You cannot spread what we call the third-party reputation. So you can't, if you didn't buy from some supplier, you can't just see his reputation and say, hey, this is important, please, friends, notice that this guy has this reputation. You can only spread if you are the evaluator. But this is not so, for example, in all the cases, anthropological cases that we studied. In those cases, it is important that the gossiper is not the evaluator. Everybody repeats the gossip. And in basic gossip, for example, about celebrities, practically never the gossiper is the evaluator. I've skipped the beneficiary, which is the third, because it's a bit more complicated. We also decided to distinguish the beneficiary, which is the party that the norm implicitly protects, implicitly or explicitly in some cases protects. So in all those cases, if there is a social phenomenon, there can be a group of people that are beneficiary of this phenomenon, and that can be, in many cases, individuated. Now, in most cases that you can think, the beneficiary is the general population, and that's why very often it's not modeled. So a norm of honesty, don't kill, is a kind of norm that is good for everybody. But there are cases in which this is different, and we will see that some of those cases are interesting, because some norms are meant to protect specific groups. So if you think of, for example, norms of when there is a role differences, like parents or tutors and children, then there are some norms on the behavior of tutors that are meant for the children, not for the tutors, or teacher-students. These are two distinct groups, and there are norms for the teachers that are meant for the benefit of the, of the students, not for the teachers themselves. Of course, the agents play more than one role. And on the basis of this, we created some provisions of what happens when you operationalize those things. So depending on the superposition of those groups, if they are the same or they are partially the same or they are completely distinct, then we have a provision of how much the reputation will diffuse. So if just to make one example, let's look at the third one. The third one is the superposition between gossipers and, I don't wonder if I can, yeah, I can. Gossipers and targets, and evaluators and targets. If the people that are distributing the news, the gossipers, are the same that get evaluated, then we foresee a fear of retaliation. In those cases, if I say that you're a terrible researcher, then you will say that I am a terrible researcher. So I will be wary to tell you that you're a terrible researcher, because I don't want to start this war of who's the worst. Let's try to be friends. This gives you a responsibility when you make an evaluation, and it causes what we call a leniency bias. We tend to give evaluations that are a little better than we would expect. And this has an effect. For example, it should be an ingredient of any theories on open or closed peer review, which is now being much debated. There's been a recent paper by Flamino Squazzoni and others that try to evaluate the difference between publishing reviews with your name together with the published papers. I had some examples. Well, transmission. We tried to run some experiments on the basis of this theory. I will just tell one quickly because it's relatively fun. We tried to study what happens with students, indeed. And we organized in a social psychology class, so not very representative of the general population, I'm afraid. In a social psychology class, we organized a special lecture from an external teacher. And that teacher just didn't exist. But it was announced that it was in the program. Then the day of this class, this teacher, of course, didn't arrive because he didn't exist. And the student, with the help of some student who was participating in the study, were kept in the room. And then two experimenters started to spread two different reasons, saying, I know this guy, and he's always late because he doesn't care about students. And the other one tried to spread a positive story, like, I know this guy, and he's late because he always stops to help people, and then he never arrives to meetings in time. After 20 minutes, we stopped the experiment and tried to collect which story was spreading faster. And I mean, I guess you can imagine that in this kind of cases, the negative story tends to spread faster than the positive story. This was instead simulation evidence, one of my favorite results. It's a false reputation in social control. We ran a set of simulations on the basis of those ideas, and we found that in our setting, calumny was preferable to courtesy. So it was easy to find a system in which accurate information would be perfect, of course, because you're in a system in which you have to find out cheaters and try not to interact again with them. But if you do it with accurate information, then it all depends from the speed on which information spreads. But what about false information then? If you introduce just some noise, you don't even need intentionality. If you introduce some noise, some of those normal acts will be read as cheating and vice versa. So what will happen? How will the system develop? If we let evolve the system, we will find that it's safer for people to allow some level of calumny in the system, which means that some good guys will be unjustly excluded, then allow courtesy, so allow some cheaters to be tolerated. Okay, there is another ingredient here of the theory, but I will just say a couple of words. So the first part of the theory was the distinguishing the roles of reputation and trying to understand their effect. And the second part was distinguishing two levels of the object, the cognitive objects, which are the levels of image and reputation. Image comes from a famous study, evolutionary study of image in The Prisoner's Dilemma. And the reputation is what we call the full artifact. So in this model, the reputation is a belief about the existence of a communication. Now we're again more in the clouds. We're even more removed than before from the truth level. There is a truth level of something, which means you're a cheater or not a cheater with respect to some social convention. And then there is an evaluation of this, because if you interact, maybe you can recognize that if this guy is a cheater. Then this information is spread, and a proper reputation is knowledge about the existence of this information. So you can, you see that if you put all this scaffolding in place, you can find out that there are several ways to lie in this system. So there are several ways to characterize misinformation. You could just lie about your experience, or you could lie about transmitting this experience, or you could lie about the existence of a voice. This is very subtle, because this kind of lie is the kind of everybody says that. And this is not true, because not everybody is saying this, but it's very easy to reconvey. So if you start spreading something like this, then it's very likely that it will spread in the population, and at some point it will become true, totally independently of the real truth value. I mean, there is this is extremely dangerous in cases in which proving the truth is difficult. So psychologists say that one of the most dangerous calumnies and gossips is when, for example, in high school settings, you tell a story in which a woman had been pregnant, but now not more. That's a terrible calumny and spreads like fire, because it touches the cores of people. People want to repeat it. And even if it's not true, there's no way to prove it, and it's very difficult that the object of this calumny will be able to confront the information. So this is the dark power of reputation. I don't have time, I guess, to go in details, but you can imagine. And I wanted to end with this list of questions. 38 seconds on my clock, so let's go straight to reputation and policy. I was thinking about reputation and policy, of course, just because of this setting. So this is the new slide in the setting. And you can immediately imagine that you could study how the reputation of some policy could impact policy reception and policy compliance. I've had a quick check on the literature, and this doesn't seem to be much studied. So this is a good chance to do something, really. I found something on policy credibility, so I guess that this, of course, is important. If you're enacting a policy to, for example, reduce the number of accidents, then if you want people to comply, you need this policy to be credible. I found this paper, but it's from '96, so there's something else should be available. And I think that we have some good research questions here, like what is policy reputation, first of all? Is that an individual reputation or a group reputation? The two things are different, and group reputation is being studied just recently, while the studies on reputation are much more established. And in the end, can policy reputation be manipulated? I mean, I've told you many ways you can use gossip to manipulate a situation. Can you convince people, even if it's not true, that some policy, everybody thinks that this policy is very good? This is something that could be studied in the political discourse. And of course, reputation at the collective level and at the institutional level is an important thing. I mean, you can imagine why I choose Volkswagen pictures to illustrate this slide. I mean, your reputation is important, and the people will speak and spread the news, both, but remember that both the true ones and the false ones will be spread. And I guess I'll stop here. Look what I've spared you.
If there is one question,
yeah, that's all.
We can take time. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And when I talked to you 2 days ago about apparitions I have seen, yeah, and the belief behind my Christian background. I had no idea that you are mine researcher, but I'm not speaking about this now. I want to tell you that I want to just say about yesterday's speech by a man who has an absolutely great reputation. He's the former president of Finnish Academy of Sciences, and he used his reputation to say something extraordinarily different from medical community. He said that there is no science behind euthanasia. And when I asked a question about this, then afterwards people came to tell me that they personally know people who have been diagnosed as brain dead and they are alive, like I said. And you often need to have really good reputation to say something that is very, very different from the ordinary assumption, because euthanasia is, as you know, it's used often to hunt for organs also and to justify it. That was it. And I just want really to thank the Academy for extraordinary interesting seminar. Thank you.
Well, thanks. This wasn't a question, but I understand the point that reputation is an asset. So if you want to defend something that is different from the accepted truth, then having a strong reputation will help. And that's the matter of how to acquire then this strong reputation.
Okay, thank you. I think that now working groups are already, or people who are responsible for working group, they are already waiting for you. So please check your watches and keep in your mind that 10:50 we have a coffee here down. So thank you. And now you all know the way. Please move to groups.
In town.